Everyone wants to make better decisions, but when the inputs are wrong, the outcomes can't be right. So let's fix the data, the logic, and the thinking together. I'm Dr. Denaige McDonnell, and this is The Good Think. Hey guys, thanks for joining me on another episode of The Good Think. This week I've got a really juicy topic for you. I want to start off by imagining a parent in Toronto who's been skipping meals so that their children can eat, or a senior citizen choosing between medication and groceries this week. These scenarios are not outliers, but they're actually playing out daily across wealthy countries like Canada and the United States. And in a bitter irony, institutions meant as temporary charity have become a permanent fixture of the social safety net. Food banks, once a stopgap in hard times, now serve as a second-tier welfare system that feeds millions but leaves the root causes of hunger completely untouched. Today's episode is all about how we got here, how society took on a job that we expected government to do, how we've commercialized the act of feeding the hungry, and how we now are facing an uncomfortable truth that charity alone cannot end hunger. We're not really arguing for one solution or another, but instead we're unpacking the complexity of this system to explore the trade-offs that we've made, what the data show about hunger since food banks began. Food banks are a relatively recent invention. The first modern one was launched in Arizona in the late 1960s by a fellow named John Van Hengel. He was a volunteer, and his actions were in response to rising hunger during a recession. And that idea quickly spread, and Canada's first food bank opened in Edmonton in 1981, also during an economic downturn which was caused by an oil industry crash. At the time, it was described as a temporary emergency measure. Policymakers believed that once the economy recovered, the food bank would no longer be needed and its doors would naturally close. But that day never came. 4 decades later, food banks haven't disappeared. In fact, they've multiplied. By 2015, Canada had over 800 food banks and 3,000 food programs that served about 850,000 people every month. But by 2025, monthly visits had surged to 2.2 million. Now, it took decades to reach just 1 million visits per month, and it only took a few years more to double that number. Food Banks Canada has called this dramatic rise Canada's new normal. The United States has followed a similar pattern, and their food banking began slightly earlier, with St. Mary's Food Bank opening in 1967. It's largely attributed as being the very first food bank in the U.S. Now, while the U.S. has larger government food assistance programs, charity networks, the food bank situation expanded rapidly there as well. By 2022, there was about 49 million Americans, that works out to about 1 in 6 of the population, that were relying on charitable food assistance. Feeding America is the country's largest network, and it coordinates about 200 food banks and over 60,000 pantries across the nations. Now, in both countries, what started as emergency relief has become an entrenched system, and the emergency food network is no longer an exception. It's now part of how hunger is managed. So why did a temporary fix become permanent? Well, that's because food banks filled a gap left by government, and over time, government grew very comfortable with that, and society let them. In Canada, the contrast is especially stark. Unlike in America, which has a national food assistance program, they've got things like SNAP and WIC that are designed to provide buying power to those who need assistance. Canada doesn't have a federal program dedicated to feeding people. And so when Canadians can't afford food, they rely on community-run food banks, which operate without stable government funding and depend on donations and volunteers. As one historian put it, food banks have become a second tier of social assistance, stepping in where welfare programs have fallen short. This shift began in the 1980s during that deep recession that I mentioned. At that time, churches, unions, and local groups all stepped up, and they were starting food banks out of compassion, but also out of necessity because social supports were overwhelmed. And over time, this grassroots response has allowed governments to take a step back. As charities stepped up, political pressure to implement lasting structural solutions faded. Critics warned early on that food banks don't solve hunger. Emergency food doesn't raise incomes. It doesn't build housing. It doesn't create jobs. All of the things that are needed for true food stability. And as food policy expert Graham Rich has put it, food banks treat the symptoms, but not the disease. For politicians, charity has become a convenient fallback. Food banks offer a way to manage hunger without having to fix the system that causes it. During crises, governments often double down on this shortcut. And when COVID-19 hit, Canada quickly injected $100 million into emergency food relief, mostly through food banks. Now, the help was real, but the signal was telling. Even in a national emergency, the instinct was to fund charity and not to reform policy. But hunger isn't an unsolvable mystery. It's a result of broken basics, inadequate wages, housing issues, social assistance, income supports, all of this. A government that runs its core systems well doesn't need to invent new programs to end food insecurity. It simply needs to ensure people can afford to eat. And so the deeper question isn't why food banks still exist. It's why we haven't gotten the underlying fundamentals right. Now, critics will argue that framing food as charity lets government off the hook. And that's because it shifts hunger from being a public responsibility to a private act of goodwill. And in a country like Canada, where the right to food is enshrined in law, that's more than ironic. It's a systemic contradiction, and one that we're letting happen all the time. As one food bank CEO bluntly put it, every visit to a food bank is a policy failure. If people had adequate income, housing, and support, they wouldn't need charity to eat. And what this reveals is not a food crisis, but a governance one. We don't lack food. We actually are lacking the will to ensure people can access it through dignified, reliable means. And until we stop treating food insecurity as a charitable gap that has to be filled, and we start seeing it as a symptom of a broken public system, then food banks are going to remain busy, overwhelmed, and governments will remain unaccountable. It is super important to acknowledge that food banks have done a lot of good in individual lives. They have literally kept people alive in emergencies, put meals on the table for families who would otherwise go hungry. They are often run with heartfelt compassion by volunteers and faith groups and not-for-profits. And food banks also are recovering vast quantities of surplus food that might otherwise go to waste. They glean from grocery stores and farms and restaurants to redirect millions of pounds of edible food to those in need. And this can be seen as a win-win because we're reducing food waste while also feeding the hungry and having some positive environmental benefits as well. Now, in the United States, for example, Feeding America reports rescuing over 3.5 billion pounds of food in 2022, and that food would have just been thrown out. But instead, it was turned into 5 billion meals for people in need. However, the rise of the food bank system has also raised troubling questions, and one is the commercialization of charity. Over the decades, hunger relief has entangled with corporate interest in PR, and many large corporations will happily sponsor food drives or donate products, which certainly helps individuals in the short term, but it also serves as positive publicity and often comes with tax benefits for the donor. So food banks themselves partner with national food manufacturers and supermarket chains, and those companies in turn get to burnish their image as caring community players, even as they profit from the status quo. So critics note that some of these same corporations that are benefiting from things like low wages and high food prices that contribute to food insecurity are also the ones that are benefiting through the food bank system. And this is kind of a classic halo effect scenario where there's a lot of bias, but the underlying framework is actually flawed. These corporate donations can also generate tax deductions and often equal to the fair market value of the food. And this also helps them to avoid costly landfill fees. And I'm going to break that down in more detail later on in this episode. But for now, what I want you to know is donating food isn't a financial loss for corporations. It's a business strategy. And as one food justice advocate has put it, the business of hunger is profitable, just not for the hungry. There's also an uncomfortable dynamic of social class and saviorism that's wrapped up in food charity. Historically, charitable feeding was tied up with moral judgments and the idea that the deserving poor would be grateful for handouts from their social superiors. And echoes of this persist today. Donors and volunteers are often middle class or corporate sponsors, while the recipients are expected to line up and say thank you for whatever they're able to get. And this dynamic can inadvertently reinforce a hierarchy of giver and receiver, of benefactor and grateful beneficiary. Now, while generosity is laudable, framing food support as a gift and rather than a right can really erode dignity. People in need may feel shame or obligation when, in a rights-based view, they shouldn't have to. No one owes gratitude for access to basic necessities that everyone should have. And by contrast, if food were adequate and it was insured through living wages and income supports, it would be an entitlement of citizenship and not charity. Now, the heavy reliance on volunteer labor in food banks is also a double-edged sword. On one hand, it shows community solidarity and it keeps overhead costs low. But on the other hand, it enables governments to offload responsibilities. Food banks are propped up by armies of volunteers who are often retirees, students, and church groups who donate their time for free. This very model gives the government yet another out, effectively subsidizing what arguably should be public services. And they do it with private charity work. During the pandemic and other crises, volunteers risked their health to keep food distributions going. Society celebrates them, and rightly so. But seldom do we ask if it's fair that our solution to hunger depends on people working for free in church basements. Hunger is not a problem of food at all, but of income and government fiscal responsibility, and yet we continue to address it with canned goods and armies of volunteers. Maintaining the food bank system requires enormous resources every single year, which raises the question, is this the best we can do with our money and our effort? Charitable food networks must consistently solicit donations of food and money. They organize food drives, they're managing warehouses, arranging transport logistics. Now consider what it takes to sustain 2.2 million food bank visits per month in Canada, or to distribute over 5 billion meals a year in the US. It really is a Herculean effort, and it repeats itself year after year after year. In a very real sense, we are treating the symptoms of hunger on an ongoing basis rather than curing the disease of poverty. And this approach can be thought of as an indefinitely running Band-Aid program. It's one that may actually be more expensive in the long run than fixing the underlying issues. So how might resources be wasted in the current model? Well, for one, many people donate food items themselves. They're buying products at retail prices to put in a food drive bin. Now, while that's well-intentioned, it really is economically inefficient. Food banks can stretch cash much further than individuals thanks to their ability to do things like bulk purchasing and rescuing surplus. So a dollar donated to a food bank might provide several meals through their networks, whereas a dollar spent by a consumer on a canned good yields exactly one can. So when we channel goodwill into donated goods instead of cash or policy change, some potential impact is lost. And then there's also duplication of infrastructure. We've built a parallel food distribution system for the poor. That sounds really rough, but it actually is what we've done. We have separated feeding the poor from the normal market with its own trucks, warehouses, and staff, all to move food that largely originated in the same commercial supply chain. Every can of soup or loaf of bread that goes from the supermarket to a food bank to a client could hypothetically have gone directly to that person in need through normal channels if they had the money. So then we've got some loss of value there as well, and some of the environmental benefits that we have of rescuing food and the impact to the environment is lost in additional transportation. So in essence, we collect food, much of it surplus or near expiry, from those who have too much, and then we redistribute it to those who have too little. So instead of simply giving people who are short on money the means to buy what they need, we're supplying them with what we deem to be available and appropriate for them. Now, the scale of charitable effort is massive. Canadians have created over 700 food banks and thousands of affiliated programs. Food Banks Canada counts that they have over 5,000 different food banks and programs as of 2025. With the National Food Banks Canada organization alone reporting revenues of about $36 million in 2017, and that's not counting the budgets of all the local food banks. In the U.S., Feeding America reported total operating expenses around $3.5 billion in 2022, and that is, again, only part of the picture because the value of donated food that's distributed is actually much higher. Now, these charitable dollars, the volunteer hours, the donated goods, they're all private resources that are being used to address a public issue. If the same billions in charity were instead invested in stronger social support programs or direct income support, it could potentially reduce the need for charity in the first place. For example, poverty in Canada is estimated to cost taxpayers around $84 billion per year, when you factor in increased healthcare, social services, and lost productivity. So that's a very inclusive number. But in other words, we're paying for poverty one way or another, if not through robust welfare and income supports, then through the downstream costs of charity and crisis management. And there's also hidden inefficiencies. Food waste still occurs even in the charitable system, and some donated foods spoil or they're just not a right fit for a family's needs. And human potential is wasted when people are stuck in food bank lines rather than participating fully in the economy. The charity model may inadvertently divert energy from systemic solutions. So we might be asking how much innovation or advocacy capacity is lost because nonprofits are busy arranging canned peas on shelves. Every year that we organize holiday food drives, are we essentially doing the same work over and over instead of solving why people are hungry in the first place? I know these are uncomfortable questions, but they get at why some observers see the current model as costly perpetual motion without actual benefit or solution in the long term. So one way to understand the impact or the limitations of 4+ decades of food banking is to look at the KPIs of hunger. These are the key performance indicators that we have for food security and how they've changed since this charity expansion. Now, the blunt answer is that hunger has not been vanquished. By many measures, it has worsened or at least become more visible. So take Canada. In 1981, there were no food bank usage statistics because the concept was brand new. But today, in 2025, Food Banks Canada's hunger count reports are a main barometer of hardship. The latest figures show close to 2.2 million visits to food banks across the country every single month, and children represent 1/3 of those visits. That is a record high after 45 years of very deliberate, very concentrated, very focused efforts to alleviate hunger through the food bank system. Another metric, the prevalence of household food insecurity, is measured by Statistics Canada through surveys. In 2005, when monitoring began, about 9% of Canadian households were food insecure. And by 2022, that figure had nearly doubled to 17.8% of households. And if you want to put a number to that, it's almost 7 million people, and nearly 2 million of those are children. And by 2024, an estimated 10 million Canadians, and that is 1/4, 25% of our population, lived in a household that struggled to afford food at some point in the year. These numbers spiked during tough times. For instance, food insecurity jumped from about 10.5% to 14.5% during the COVID-19 pandemic's first year. And even after temporary income supports, food prices and housing costs have pushed more people to the brink. Food bank use in Canada was 25% higher in 2014 than before the 2008 recession, and then surged exponentially throughout the pandemic. Now, in the United States, the federal government's main hunger indicator is also food insecurity, which is measured by the USDA, and it hovered between 10 and 12% of households in the late 1990s throughout the 2010s, with a spike around 15% in the 2008 recession. And despite an expansive charity network, tens of millions remain food insecure. And their number in 2022 was 49 million people. That's about 1 in 8 Americans that relied on charitable food assistance. So one could say the KPI has changed in the sense that we no longer measure success by whether the soup kitchen lines disappear, but by whether fewer people experience food insecurity. By that modern measure, we are failing. Chronic hunger and food insecurity trends have not significantly improved despite the rise of charity. Food banks have grown busier, and the success for a food bank is often tallied in pounds of food distributed or number of clients served, metrics that perversely go up when underlying conditions worsen. So the way that we're measuring, the metrics that we're measuring, are also even skewing our perception on this very big systemic problem. As a veteran U.S. anti-hunger leader once noted, we can't food bank our way out of hunger. And in fact, when the government temporarily boosted support through expanded SNAP benefits or emergency income payments, food bank demand did abate slightly, showing that policy can relieve pressure. But when those measures ended, food lines grew again. And it really is a sobering indication that charity can buffer hardship and can make us feel good about what we're doing in the short term, but it cannot end hunger without broader change. Now, this story of food banks is not simply a tale of good or bad. It is a story of trade-offs, of timelines, and of unintended consequences. On one hand, we as a society asked for this in a way. People saw neighbors going hungry and said, we have to do something now. That instinct led to an impressive grassroots apparatus that does help millions of people on any given day. Food banks provide immediate relief. They engage volunteers and donors in a cause. They foster compassion and community involvement, all good things. And in many individual cases, a food bank visit means a child is fed at night, or that a worker can still eat and pay the rent. And these are very real and very important outcomes. It's hard to put a price on alleviating that human suffering in the moment. But on the other hand, relying on charity can derail momentum for long-term solutions. The more we normalized food banks, the less urgency there seemed to be for bold anti-poverty policy. And it was never an explicit decision by society to say, let charities handle hunger indefinitely. But that has become the de facto approach. And only now, after decades, are we openly questioning it. Even food bank leaders are saying enough is enough. Charity alone cannot solve a crisis this deep. It's time for coordinated action from all levels of government. That's what was said by the director of Toronto's Daily Bread Food Bank in 2025. Food Banks Canada CEO has warned that we cannot build a strong Canada when our neighbors are hungry, urging systemic changes so that no one needs to line up for food charity. The very institutions that stepped in to fill the gap are now pleading for the government to take responsibility. They conduct research like the annual hunger count or local Who's Hungry reports, not just to count the needy, but to prod policymakers into action with detailed recommendations. And the key trade-off comes down to this. Do we address hunger through the food or through the income? The charity model focuses on supplying food to people without enough, but the policy model would focus on ensuring people have enough money or support to buy their own food. The charitable approach is tangible and immediate. You can see bags of groceries and know that dinner's covered tonight. And the policy approach is more abstract and longer term. It's about raising minimum wages, adjusting social assistance, changing business policy, building affordable housing, all of the things that go into sustainable living and human rights. And all of that should reduce the number of hungry people, but it doesn't help to feed someone today. So ideally, a society would do both. It would feed the hungry today and reduce the reasons why they'll be hungry next month, right? In practice, however, resources and political capital are limited, and emphasis on one can detract from the other. And there's also a justice versus charity framing to be explored. Charity, as many ethicists will note, is voluntary and often selective, and it can never guarantee coverage for all in need. Social justice or rights-based approaches aim for entitlement. No one should have to rely on goodwill. They should be guaranteed the basics by virtue of being human or being a citizen. The existence of massive food banks in a rich country raises an uncomfortable question. Are we okay with hunger being managed by charity forever? And if not, what would it take to change the course? As we shed light on this complexity, it becomes clear that there are no quick fixes. Abolishing food banks overnight is just not a realistic solution. Too many people depend on them right now. Yet simply expanding food banks further is equally problematic, as it can further entrench a parallel system that doesn't solve hunger at its roots and actually erodes human rights and independence. Now, the path forward likely involves redefining the roles, perhaps scaling up government social support so that food banks can scale down to a more supplemental or emergency role rather than being a primary food source for so many. This could mean policies like a guaranteed basic income, which many anti-hunger groups now advocate. More affordable housing to free up household income for food, higher social assistance rates, or other income security measures. Now, studies have shown that when income rises for the poorest, food insecurity rates fall. People don't generally lack knowledge of how to buy food, they're just lacking the means to actually acquire it. And at the same time, any transition must be handled carefully. Food banks have become deeply embedded in communities, and many people trust them as non-judgmental help in hard times. In some remote or underserved areas, food charities might be more accessible than government offices. Completely decommercializing hunger relief might also mean confronting powerful interests. For instance, persuading corporations and affluent donors to support systemic change, like those wage increases or higher taxes for social programs, with the same enthusiasm they have for sponsoring charity galas. That's a big ask, and that's a big change in the way things work right now. And there's also the human element. Volunteering at a food bank or donating to a food drive is a concrete way for people to feel they're making a difference. Moving to policy solutions can feel impersonal by comparison. And the challenge will be to channel that public goodwill towards supporting broad solutions, to get people to see a living wage or a new social policy as an act of fighting hunger just as much as dropping off a bag of groceries is. The rise of food banks in Canada, with the comparisons that I've made to the United States and their food bank system, shows us that there is a poignant irony of modern society. We've stepped up as a community to feed those that are falling through the cracks. But in doing so, we actually made the cracks wider. And we've let our government step back from something that should be in their remit. What began as people doing good out of kindness has evolved into a vast system that at times has derailed focus from the major social issue at stake. Why are people hungry to begin with? Now, the money, food, and time poured into this system are immense, and yet the key performance indicators of hunger show persistent or growing need, not decisive victory over food insecurity. Now, this doesn't mean that food banks were a mistake, because like I mentioned, they have saved thousands, maybe even millions of lives. And as a society, we find ourselves facing unintended consequences from our good actions. And that hurts. It doesn't feel good, so we want to avoid it. But there's multiple actors in this system. There's governments and charities and corporations and individual citizens, each of them with their own role, their own expectations, and their own investment and reasons for being part of the system. It's a complex tale with no easy villain. Everyone wanted to help, and yet the outcome is unsatisfactory. And the opportunity we have now is to write the next chapter differently. We can appreciate what food banks have done, but also imagine a future where they're smaller or even obsolete because social policy has ensured that no one needed to line up for food in the first place. And in the meantime, the challenge is balancing immediate compassion with long-term justice, making sure that we don't let feeding the line distract us from shortening the line. And so the conversation is shifting from celebrating food banks uncritically to asking tough questions about why they exist and how we can reduce the need. That ultimately is a sign of a maturing society, one that isn't just complaining about the status quo, but actually striving to change the conditions that made charity the fallback in the first place. Now, the numbers are hard to crunch because not everything is clearly labeled, but by researching and reviewing reports from Hunger Count 2025 and Food Banks Canada own annual filings, I estimate that unpaid labor is worth somewhere between $100 and $200 million annually. That's using estimates of volunteer hours at a modest hourly rate of $25 per hour. So between $100 and $200 million of volunteer labor is given. Donated food comes in between $3 and $6 million, and cash donations from individuals is around $11 million. So in total, every year, Canadians are giving between $115 and $215 million of value to patch a system that could be structured as public policy. Now, why this matters is that public service is happening without compensation. Canadians are doing what is typically the work of government, running a second-tier welfare system, and doing it for free. Another issue is that it's subsidized with after-tax dollars. So every donated can of soup or dollar has already been taxed once. And then when you give it away, you might get back 30 to 50% as a tax credit, but you still lose money. And as I already mentioned, most of what's donated doesn't get tax receipts. And there's also a justice gap. Canadians are, in effect, propping up the food system for the poorest, while the tax system benefits from their generosity. Meanwhile, the systemic causes, those low wages, unaffordable housing, they are all going unaddressed. And so Canadians might be feeling proud of the social solidarity and the compassion that they've delivered over the past 4 decades and feel a sense of generosity. But They might also feel exploited by a system that's offloading government responsibility onto citizens and then turning around and only offering partial tax breaks in return. But people also might be concerned that this charity-first model makes it easier for governments to avoid the political will to fix poverty structurally. And of course, you might be feeling frustrated that despite billions in unpaid and donated resources, food insecurity has doubled since 2005. Retailers like Loblaw, Sobeys, Metro, and Walmart donate tens of millions of pounds of food to food banks each year. Now, this food is often perfectly safe, but nearing expiry, or maybe it's like cosmetically imperfect. For grocers, donating it serves a few purposes. It avoids costly landfill and waste hauling fees, which can run up to $180 per ton. It also helps them to meet their environmental, social, and governance targets for waste reduction. And it generates tax deductions for them, often equal to the fair market value of food. And of course, it's building their brand goodwill and customer loyalty through highly publicized food drives and donation bins. Now, donating food isn't a financial loss for corporations. It is a business strategy. There's another layer here. Food banks are not just recipients of donations. They are also paying customers. As donations fall short of demand, food banks spend tens of millions of dollars annually on food. Daily Bread Food Bank alone now spends nearly $30 million a year on food purchases. And these purchases are often made through the very grocery stores that also donate, creating a two-way revenue relationship. Now, I want to talk about taxes here because there's a really important understanding that I think people need to have to sort of complete the picture of food banks. So when a company like a grocery store donates to a food bank, it must report the value of the food as income. But it's also able to deduct the exact same amount as a charitable donation. And so the result of that is that there's no net income from the transaction of donating food. And there is a tax reduction of about 26%, which is the average of corporate tax in Canada. So what that means is if a store donates $10,000 worth of food, it will end up saving roughly $2,600 in taxes. Add to that the avoided disposal costs of waste food and the positive aspects of their public reputation, and the business case for giving becomes really, really clear. But that works differently for individuals. When regular people donate food, like dropping off a can in the grocery store bin, they almost never receive a tax receipt. No receipt means no tax credit. So even if there is a tax receipt issued, the return is modest, sitting at just 15% back on the first $200 and incrementally more as a percentage after that. Unless you're donating very large amounts and carefully tracking it, the tax benefit is negligible. And what about that $2 or $5 that you donate at the checkout? Well, that money does go to charity, but because it's collected anonymously through the till, you don't get a tax receipt. Neither does the organization, but it's money that goes unrecognized. The store doesn't get a tax break, but many of them are issuing the collected donations as gift cards rather than direct cash to the food bank. And so that means that your charitable donation gets spent back at the store, which keeps the revenue in-house. Now, that's not fraud, but it's definitely a strategic business move that's done on the backs of Canadians. So while Canadians are giving their time, money, and goods out very generously, the largest financial benefits quietly are flowing to corporations and the government. And this is an imbalance that most people never notice. So let's summarize the winners and the losers in the food bank system so that we can really understand who's benefiting. Short term, there is benefit to individuals, there's no doubt. But long term, those individuals are not benefiting from an elevated place in their life. They're not benefiting by having greater dignity or having greater independence or greater food security. They're staying the same. Now, the winners are the corporations because they're benefiting in multiple ways. They save on their waste disposal costs. They receive tax deductions for donations. They earn public goodwill. They enhance their brand reputation through visible charitable partnerships. And in some cases, they even recoup charitable dollars when customer donations collected at the checkout are issued as store-specific gift cards to the food banks. And that money ultimately returns as revenue. And so it's a circular model: donate, deduct, and sell, where the store rarely loses. Meanwhile, governments benefit indirectly. They're avoiding the political and financial cost of deeper reform while maintaining social stability through outsourced goodwill. Tax incentives and unpaid labor stretch public responsibility without writing new policy or updating old one. And the losers are individual Canadians because they are carrying a disproportionate share of the load. They give free labor worth $100 to $200 million per year. They're donating after-tax dollars and often receiving no meaningful tax credit in return. At checkout, they're giving their generous and anonymous donations without receipt or recognition, while the store gets the brand boost and future sales. And those who rely on food banks are continuing to live in this system where access to food is a matter of charity and not right. And this isn't to say that food banks do harm. Quite the opposite. They keep people alive. But the economics of how they function should challenge the story we tell ourselves about community and compassion. When the public gives the most and receives the least, we must be asking, is this generosity or just exploitation disguised as kindness? We need to be asking, if Canadians are already giving $200 million in unpaid labor and millions more in cash, wouldn't that same effort be more effective if channeled through a robust public system, one that actually solves hunger rather than just managing it? Charity has become a stand-in for justice, and in a country as wealthy as Canada, that is a problem. And it's not just about food. It's about responsibility. It's about government fiscal responsibility. It's about individual independence and dignity. And it's about whether we want to live in a society where corporations and government benefit most from a system built on the unpaid work and generosity of ordinary, everyday people. I'm Dr. Denaige McDonnell, and that was A Good Think. Find more episodes and articles at thegoodthink.ca.